Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today I received the Nintendo 64 controller made by Nintendo for the Switch Online service. Let's take a look and see how it compares to the original Nintendo 64 controller, as well as take it apart and get a closer look at the analog stick. But before we begin, if you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up. And if you haven't yet, consider subscribing. That is the best way to let me know you enjoy the content on this channel. Now let's get started. So the first thing I want to note is this came in a very sturdy box. I mean, this is a lot more sturdy than the ones I see that come from the store as rewards. Okay, so here's the box. So if you're wanting to collect this, just know it does come shipped in a very sturdy box that you can discard afterwards and put this on display if that's what you're wanting to do. But let's take a look inside this box too, because I'm actually going to use this. Okay, so it comes with the USB-C cable for charging, and I believe this is one of the Nintendo branded cables, which I think those are kind of really cool. I don't know if the camera's picking it up or not, but it's got Nintendo written on the end there. Okay, my first impression on this is this feels really close to the original, and you feel the weight of it kind of towards the back, like that's where the rumble is, like you would if the actual rumble pack was inserted. So I'm going to compare this against an actual Nintendo 64 controller. Now this may look funny being two-tone, because even when I was younger I liked to mod them, so I would mismatch the backs with the fronts, so they feel really close. This is feeling lighter, but of course I don't have the rumble pack in it. But yeah, this feels really the same size-wise, thickness and everything. Buttons feel the same. The analog stick on this one feels a little tighter, but this one may just be worn out. I'd have to have like a brand new one really to test that. But I do notice that it has the 8 directional notches here in the analog controller, just like the original. So I thought I would test this just to be sure, and there is a little bit of difference in the weight distribution. So when I balance the controller with my index fingers about where the D-pad and the C sticks are, and right before the slope, it sits perfectly balanced. But on this one, you can see I can't balance it. The weight shifted a little more forward. Overall, the weight feels really close. I would say the original one with the rumble pack in it is probably a little bit heavier, but overall it's still pretty close. Not a deal breaker, but just something to be aware of. Okay, so let's take this thing apart, and in typical Nintendo fashion, these are all tri-wing screws. I'm not sure why they did that. I just looked at my original Nintendo 64 controller and it used Phillips head, so I'm not sure why they switched them. Okay, so the first thing I noticed when I get this apart is that the rumble motor is kind of right here in this little housing where the rumble pack would be, so that's probably why the weight is pretty close, but probably since it's not down as much, it probably causes not to be balanced exactly the same. Now the rest of the screws in here are small Phillips heads, so that should be pretty easy if you can get to this part, but you will need a tri-wing to get to this far. So as I'm taking this apart, I found out the analog stick is a completely separate module that you really only need to disconnect the connector that goes to the board in order to get out. So that's really nice if you need to replace it. It's not like hard soldered onto the main board. Now in order to open this, you need to remove this one black screw really tight, and then these ends just unsnap and the whole housing opens up. So I like the redesign of the analog stick here. It still uses these gears like the original one did, but it seems to be a much better design, and I'm sure this is to help give it kind of the similar feel that you had before, instead of using, like, say, an analog stick off the Pro controller. Here is one more look inside of the controller. To get to the rest of the board, you would just need to take out the Phillips head screws and disconnect the ribbons and cables that are running to the board. But one thing I did want to point out here is the rumble motor. This thing is pretty massive. It looks like it's about on scale with the size of the original one, but I wanted to note that it is completely enclosed. There's no weight hanging off the edge spinning around like the original one had. And I'm sure that's a design decision that was made to prevent anything like dust from getting into the motor and maybe wearing it out quicker. Here's a look at the battery. This, according to the part number, is the same battery that's used in the Joy-Con. I would imagine with this larger rumble motor that this controller is probably not going to last as long as a Joy-Con would, but the box doesn't really give any information about battery life, so it's going to really depend on how much you use that rumble. So before I tested this on my Switch, I wanted to see how it did with my PC, and when I connected it via USB-C, the system saw a controller, saw buttons, but it would not respond at all. Now when I switched it over to Bluetooth, it was able to detect all the buttons and the analog stick, but it also detected this X and Y rotation, which I saw it move every once in a while and couldn't figure out what it was, so I'm guessing maybe it's some type of measurement on the motor maybe. I do find this test a good way to look for things like snapback when it comes to the analog stick, and I didn't see any at all. This seemed to be very solid. One note, when I had it paired with the PC through Bluetooth, the sync light kept cycling. I'm not sure why. It seemed to function fine as a controller, but just something odd I noticed. Now I did have a little bit of trouble syncing this to my Switch the first time, and I think that was probably because I had it synced to the PC first. I did have to plug it in with the USB-C cable to get it to see it, and then could unplug the cable immediately and it was fine. Now what's really cool is that it does show a actual Nintendo 64 controller here, and you can see this a little more detail in the change grip order. That's a nice touch. I do like seeing that so you know which controller you're dealing with. I also played around with the calibration of the analog stick, and just mostly to see if I noticed it drifting off any or jumping, and it seemed to be pretty smooth in the motions. Another interesting note is when you go in and do the test buttons, the D-pad and the C buttons both show up as a directional button. I thought this was kind of an odd choice, but it seems to work. If you're in the menu system, also the C buttons can be used to go left and right through the icons of the games, just like the D-pad can. And before we begin actually playing some games, I wanted to test the latency, and you can hear this in the video, and I compare the N64 controller with the Pro controller, and the latency is sounding to me exactly the same. So there is a little bit of latency there just from being wireless and what my TV introduces, but listen here and see if you can even notice a difference. So next I want to try demoing one of the games, and I'm not going to comment as much on if I notice much latency because that could be emulation, but I do want to note things like, see the suspend game at the bottom, how it shows the actual Nintendo 64 controller. I thought that was a really cool effect. So I've played Mario Kart 64, so I have a pretty good feel for the game, especially the drifting mechanics, so I wanted to kind of see how that felt, and when I did the drifting here, it felt spot on. So the analog sticks seemed to be pretty precise and accurate based off of the original Nintendo 64 controller. And here you can see that you are actually given the correct button, in this case the C up button, in order to show the button mappings from the menu. That's a feature that you wouldn't see if you were to, say, use a third-party Nintendo 64 controller. And here's a quick demo of Dr. Mario showing you that the D-pad and the C buttons do function separately. I just wanted to make sure of that since they didn't seem to in the main menu. But when you hit C up, you'll notice that you get this little shadow of a pill, so you know that that function's working. And before I give my final thoughts, one more thing I wanted to point out, that this product number is the HAC 43, which we did see kind of floating around before the Nintendo Direct that announced that these games would be available for the Switch Online service. So that kind of clears up any confusion, or if anybody was wondering if that might be something still to come. Nope, this is HAC 43. And my final impressions of this controller is I think that it's great. I can't think of a better way to play these games on this service than with this controller. First, the rumble is great. You don't get any type of weird buzzing from the controller like you would get from the Rumble Pack being in, where it might vibrate. If you notice, that rumble was padded all around, so it's nice and silent, but you can really feel it in your hands. The analog stick is, like I said, a little stiffer than the original, but that might be because of the age of mine. I'm not real sure, but overall it didn't feel bad. I really like how the menu buttons in the emulator matched the controller, so there was no question as to which button you needed to use. One complaint that I do have is that there's not really an X button. The reason that's important is because there's not a quick way to close software if you don't have an X button. Not a real big deal, you can just start another software and it'll close automatically, but just something that I noticed. And one of the big things that I actually liked is that the ZR and the home button looked oddly placed, and I was afraid they'd be difficult to find them, but they are very easy to reach, at least with my size of hands. Now maybe if you have really small hands, your finger might not reach. The first few times I hit them, I did hit the wrong button, but I very quickly got the hang of it because you could feel the shape of them under your finger pretty easily to know which one you've got. So what are your thoughts? Did you get this controller? Do you like it? How does it feel? How do you think it compares to the original? Drop me a comment and let me know. I want to thank you for watching, and be good.